He pointed at her like she was livestock. She didn't flinch. That night she pointed at the sky and named stars he'd never noticed, in a language he didn't understand. The dust from Jedediah's wagon had long since settled back into the earth, a fine red powder that coated the tongue and clung to the memory of the trade. Eb Carr stood on the warped porch of his cabin, the slip of paper still balled in his fist. It wasn't a proper bill of sale. It was a greasy receipt from a mercantile in a town he'd never been to, the back of it scrawled with Jedediah's almost letters: 1 Ironheart stove, working order, 1 nanny goat, good milker, for the girl. He'd signed it with an X, as if ashamed to put his real name to the transaction. Eb hadn't signed at all. He just nodded, his jaw tight, and handed over the silver dollars he'd been saving for seed grain. The weight of them had left his pocket and entered his gut, a cold, hard knot of a thing. He looked at her now. She was standing by the empty goat pen, her back to him, watching the place where the wagon had disappeared over the rim of the flatlands. The goat, a scruffy creature with one crooked horn, stood beside her, placid and unconcerned. It was as if the two of them belonged together, and he was the intruder on his own land. Her dress was the color of the dirt, a faded calico that had seen too much sun and not enough water. Her hair was a black tangle that fell down her back, unbound. He couldn't see her face, but he could feel the stillness of her, a quiet that was different from the vast, empty quiet of the desert he knew. His quiet was a hollow thing. Hers felt full. He'd bought her because the silence in his cabin had finally grown teeth. For 2 years since his PA had died, the only sounds had been the wind and the scrape of his own fork on his plate. He'd thought another body in the space, even a silent one, might dull the edge of it. He'd seen her on the back of Jedediah's wagon when he'd ridden out to bargain for the stove, and the question had formed in his mind before he could stop it. Jedediah, a man whose soul was as cracked and dry as the riverbeds, had grinned a yellow grin. Her? She's worth less than the goat, don't speak a lick of English. Found her wandering near the mesas. Some tribe left her behind, I reckon. Eb hadn't asked what tribe. He hadn't asked her name. He'd just seen the way she looked at the horizon, not with fear, but with a kind of weary patience, and he'd made the trade. Now the reality of it settled on him. He had traded silver for a human being. The thought was a burr under his saddle, sharp and irritating. He wasn't a slaver. He was a rancher, with a patch of land that fought him every day, and a loneliness that was winning the war. He smoothed the crumpled paper on his thigh. The girl. No name. Just a thing to be owned. He spat into the dust. The sun was bleeding out across the mesas, painting the rock in shades of blood and rust. Soon, it would be dark. The cold would come creeping down from the high desert, and the stars would come out, cold and distant, and telling him nothing he didn't already know. He was alone. He had always been alone. He turned to go inside, to the cold stove and the empty chair. He didn't tell her to follow. He didn't know what he would do if she just walked away, following the ghost of the wagon tracks into the twilight. But when he opened the cabin door, he heard the soft scuff of her bare feet on the packed earth behind him, and the gentle bleat of the goat. The cabin was one room, built by his father's hands from cottonwood and mud. It smelled of old smoke, leather, and the lingering scent of his pa's pipe tobacco, a ghost he couldn't seem to scrub out. In the center of the room sat the new stove, the Ironheart, black and squat and cold. It was bigger than his old one, which had rusted through and finally collapsed in on itself a month ago. He'd been cooking over an open fire since, his food tasting of ash and his mornings filled with a raw, shivering chill. He ran a hand over the stove's smooth surface. It was a solid thing, a good thing. He tried to focus on that, on the utility of it, the simple mechanics of heat and iron. But his eyes kept sliding to the corner where she stood, a shadow wrapped in dust-colored cloth. She hadn't moved from the doorway, her hand resting on the goat's back. Her eyes, the color of dark, wet earth, were taking in the room. Not with fear, he noted again, but with a slow, deliberate appraisal. She looked at the narrow cot against the far wall, the rough-hewn table with its 2 chairs, the shelves holding his few tins and sacks of flour. Her gaze lingered on the hearth, on the pile of firewood he'd stacked there that morning. He felt a sudden, sharp shame at the meagerness of it all. He was a man who owned so little that his entire life could be seen in a single glance. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and abrasive in the quiet. "Wood's there," he said, pointing. "Stove needs feeding." He didn't know if she understood the words, but she understood the gesture. She moved with a liquid grace that surprised him, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She knelt by the hearth, her long fingers selecting pieces of mesquite and juniper, laying them inside the stove's belly with a practiced care. He watched her, his arms crossed over his chest, feeling awkward and useless in his own home. He should be doing this. It was his stove, his wood. But she moved as if she'd been tending fires her whole life, as if this was a ritual she knew by heart. When the kindling was laid, she looked up at him. Her eyes were not asking for permission, but for the next piece of the puzzle. He grunted and reached for the tin of matches on the mantelpiece. He struck one, the flare of it a small sun in the growing dark. He held it out to her. She didn't take it. Instead, she leaned in close, her face illuminated by the tiny flame. He could see the fine lines around her eyes, the smudge of dirt on her cheek. She smelled of dust and sage and something else, something wild and clean, like the air after a rainstorm. She watched the flame for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she blew it out, a soft puff of breath, and the light was gone. Ebb stood there in the sudden dark, the dead match in his fingers, a fool's anger rising in him. What game was this? He was about to strike another, to bark an order, but she was already moving. She reached into a small pouch at her waist, a thing he hadn't noticed before, and drew out 2 stones. In the faint light from the open door, he saw her strike them together. Once. Twice. On the 3rd strike, a spark leaped, a tiny defiant star in the gloom. It caught the tinder she had placed at the front of the stove. A small orange worm of light appeared, then grew, and a curl of smoke rose, fragrant and sharp. She fed it slivers of bark until the flame was strong enough to lick at the larger pieces of wood. She did it all without a word, her movements economical and precise. He felt a strange dislocation, as if he was watching a scene from someone else's life. He had bought her, but in this moment, in the simple act of making a fire, she seemed to own the space more than he did. The fire caught, and a warm, golden light pushed back the shadows. It flickered across her face as she closed the stove door, the iron latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. She sat back on her heels, watching the small grate on the door, where the light glowed like a captive sunset. He stood there for a long time, the useless matches still in his hand, the knot in his gut tightening. He had wanted to fill the silence, but she had brought a new kind, one that was deeper and more ancient than his own. It was the silence of stones and fire and the turning of the earth, and he had no words to break it. Later, when the stove was throwing a steady, comforting heat and the goat was tied to the porch rail, he sat at the table and ate his meal of beans and stale bread. He had gestured for her to eat, pushing a plate towards the other chair, but she had shaken her head. She sat on the floor by the hearth, sipping water from a tin cup, her eyes fixed on the fire. The silence between them was a living thing now, a third presence in the room. It was not the empty, echoing silence of his loneliness, but a watchful, waiting silence. He felt her awareness of him, of every scrape of his spoon, every swallow of his breath. It was unnerving. He was used to being unobserved, to moving through his days with the unthinking freedom of a man who answers to no one. Now he felt seen. After he had cleaned his plate and set it aside, he did what he always did. He went out onto the porch to look at the weather and the stars. It was a habit his PA had taught him, a way of reading the sky for signs of rain or wind. But tonight, the sky felt different. The stars seemed brighter, sharper, as if the fire in the cabin had polished them clean. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, tracing the familiar shapes: the Big Dipper, the Hunter, the crooked line of the snake. They were his stars, his landmarks in the vast, dark ocean of the night. He heard a sound behind him and turned. She was standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm light of the cabin. The goat bleated softly and nudged her hand. She stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the wood. She walked to the edge, past him, and looked up. For a long moment she was still, her face tilted towards the heavens. He thought she was just looking, the way he was. But then she raised her arm. Her finger, long and slender, pointed towards a cluster of stars he'd always seen but never really noticed, a faint smudge of light near the horizon. And she spoke. Her voice was low, softer than he had expected, like stones rubbing together under water. The words were not words he knew. They were a melody of sounds, of clicks and soft gutturals, of long open vowels that seemed to hold the emptiness of the desert in them. She said a word, a name, and then paused, her finger still pointing. Then she moved her hand slightly, to another star, a single bright point of blue-white light, and spoke another name. She was not talking to him. She was addressing the stars themselves, greeting them like old friends. He stood frozen, listening. He had bought her for a stove and a goat, for her silence, and here she was, filling the night with a language he didn't understand, naming a world he had lived under his whole life but had never truly seen. She pointed to a third star, a fourth, her voice a quiet chant against the immense silence of the desert. He didn't know what the names meant. He didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but as he listened to the rise and fall of her strange, beautiful words, he felt something shift inside him. The cold, hard knot in his gut did not go away, but it felt different, less like a stone and more like a seed. He looked up, following her pointing finger, and for the first time in his life, he felt the dizzying, terrifying, and utterly magnificent reality of the stars. They were not just distant points of light, they were places, they had names, and a woman he had bought for silver was giving them back to him, one by one, in a language he had yet to learn. The days fell into a rhythm, marked not by the clock on the mantelpiece, its hands had been frozen at 3:30 for years, but by the sun and the needs of the land. Ebb rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime, and found her already awake. She would be outside, standing by the goat, her face turned to the east as the first pale light broke over the mesas. She never watched the sun rise. She watched the last stars fade, as if saying goodbye to them. He would build the fire in the stove now. She had shown him how to do it with the stones, but his hands were clumsy, the sparks refusing to leap for him. He felt a dull frustration at his own incompetence, and after a few failed attempts, he had gone back to using matches. She would watch him, her expression unreadable, and he would feel the heat of a flush on his neck, an anger at her silent judgment. But it wasn't judgment, he slowly realized. It was just watching. She watched everything with that same deep, unnerving stillness. She watched him mend the fence around the small patch of land where he hoped to grow corn. She watched him clean his rifle, his hands moving with a familiar, practiced ease. She watched him eat, her own plate of beans and cornbread often untouched until he had finished. He tried to talk to her at first, simple words: water, wood, food. He would point, his voice loud and slow as if she were a child or a half-wit. She would look at him, her dark eyes holding his, and then she would nod, a slow, deliberate motion that made him feel like the fool. She understood. She always understood. But she never spoke. Not to him. Not in his language. Her words were for the night. Every evening after the sun had set and the world had been stripped down to shadow and light, she would go out onto the porch. The goat would follow, its bell a single lonely note in the quiet, and she would point to the sky and speak her star names. He would stand in the doorway or sit on the top step and listen. He began to recognize the sounds, the patterns in her speech. There was a name for the bright, solitary star that appeared first in the west, a word that sounded like Ciala. There was a name for the great river of light that spilled across the center of the sky, a long, flowing phrase that felt like a sigh. He didn't know what they meant, but he began to learn their music. He started calling the first star Ciala in his own mind. It made him feel a strange, secret connection to her, to the world she inhabited. He wondered if it was her name. He tried it once, under his breath. Ciala. She was across the yard, feeding the goat a handful of dried herbs she had gathered from the scrubland. She didn't turn, didn't give any sign she had heard. But the goat lifted its head and looked right at him, its yellow eyes seeming to hold a question. He felt his face burn and turned away, angry at himself for the foolishness of it. He had work to do. He had a life to live. He couldn't spend his days mooning over a silent woman and her sky talk. He threw himself into his work with a renewed ferocity. He repaired the roof of the cabin, replacing the rotted wood and patching the leaks. He cleared a new patch of ground, his axe biting deep into the stubborn roots of the mesquite. He worked until his muscles screamed and his hands were raw, trying to sweat out the unease she had planted in him. One afternoon he decided to fix the old stove, the one that had collapsed. He didn't know why. It was useless, a heap of rusted iron. But he couldn't bring himself to haul it out to the scrap pile. It was his pa's stove. It felt like a betrayal. He dragged it out into the yard and began to take it apart, piece by piece. The iron was brittle, the bolts fused with rust. It was slow, frustrating work. She came and sat nearby in the shade of the cabin wall and watched him. She was mending her dress with a piece of thread she had unraveled from a burlap sack. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of dark tracks on the faded cloth. He ignored her, focusing on the stubborn bolt in his hand. He grunted and swore, his knuckles bloodying against the sharp edge of the metal. Finally, the bolt gave way with a screech of protest, and the side panel of the stove fell off. He peered inside. The inner wall was a solid sheet of rust and soot, but there was something else. Scratched into the metal, almost hidden by the grime, were marks. They were not letters. They were pictures, symbols, a spiral, a circle with a dot in the center, a figure with its arms raised, petroglyphs, like the ones on the rocks out in the mesas, the ones the old people had carved 1,000 years ago. He ran his finger over one of the marks, a wavy line that looked like a snake. He had seen it before, on a rock face miles from here. His PA had told him it meant water. He looked at the other marks, his heart starting to beat a little faster. He didn't know what they meant, but he knew what they were. They were a story. He looked over at her. She had stopped sewing. She was watching him, her dark eyes wide. She knew. Of course, she knew. He felt a sudden, dizzying sense of connection, a thread pulling taut between the ancient marks on the stove, the glyphs on the distant mesas, and the silent woman watching him in the shade. He looked from the stove to her and back again. He had thought the stove was just a stove, the mesas just rocks, the woman just a woman. But they were all part of something else, something older and deeper than he could comprehend. He spent the rest of the afternoon carefully taking the stove apart, cleaning each piece, looking for more marks. He found them everywhere, on the inside of the door, under the ashpan, even on the bottom of the iron legs. They were a hidden map, a secret language baked into the very heart of his home. That night, when she went out to name the stars, he followed her. He didn't stop in the doorway. He walked to the edge of the porch and stood beside her. She fell silent when he approached, her hand dropping to her side. The night pressed in, the silence vast and absolute. He waited. He didn't look at her. He looked up at the sky, at the star he now called Ciala. He pointed. His own finger felt thick and clumsy compared to hers. "Ciala," he said, his voice rough. She didn't move. He thought he had broken the spell, that his clumsy imitation had offended her. He was about to drop his hand to retreat back into his own silence when she spoke. She said the word, her voice soft and clear, Ciala. It sounded different when she said it, not just a name but a story, a history, a universe of meaning held in 3 syllables. Then she pointed to the star next to it and said another name, a name he had heard before but hadn't learned. She paused, looking at him. He understood. It was his turn. He listened, and then he tried to repeat it. His tongue fumbled with the strange sounds, but he tried. A small smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It was a fleeting thing, barely there, but it was enough. It was a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. She pointed to another star, and he listened and repeated, his voice a rough echo of her clear, bell-like tones. He was learning a new language, not of words for water and wood, but of names for the lights that burned in the endless dark. He was learning the language of the sky, and as he stood there beside her, his clumsy words joining hers in the vast, holy quiet of the desert night, he felt the seed in his gut begin to sprout, its roots reaching for a light he was only just beginning to see. The goat was her shadow. It followed her everywhere, its bell a constant, gentle counterpoint to the silence. When she went to gather herbs, its tracks mingled with her own in the dust. When she sat by the fire, it lay at her feet, its head on its folded legs. Ebb had never paid much mind to goats, but this one was different. It had a kind of quiet intelligence in its yellow, rectangular eyes. It watched him with a placid, unnerving scrutiny, as if it were weighing his soul and finding it wanting. He started leaving out a little extra water for it, a handful of the precious corn he was saving. He told himself it was for the milk. The goat was a good milker, just as Jedediah had promised. Every morning she would milk it, her hands gentle and sure, and leave a pail of the rich, frothy milk on the table. It was a new taste for him, sweet and earthy, a taste of the land itself. It was a taste of her. He found himself watching her hands. They were never still. When she wasn't milking the goat or tending the fire or mending, she was drawing. She would find a smooth, flat stone and using a piece of charcoal from the stove, she would cover it in symbols. They were the same symbols he had found inside the old stove, the same ones carved into the mesas. Spirals, suns, stick-figure men with their arms raised in praise or despair. He would watch her, fascinated. Her hands moved with a certainty, a knowledge that seemed to flow from her fingertips. She was not copying something. She was speaking. It was a language of pictures, a story told in lines and curves. One day, he brought her a piece of wood he had sanded smooth. He set it down beside her without a word. She looked at it, then up at him, her eyes questioning. He just shrugged and walked away, his heart thumping in his chest like a frightened bird. Later, he saw her working on the wood. She was not using charcoal. She had found a sharp piece of flint and was carefully, painstakingly carving the symbols into the wood. It was slow, laborious work, but she did not seem to mind. She was absorbed, lost in the world she was creating. He began to bring her things, a smooth, pale bone he found in the desert, a piece of flattened tin from a discarded can, a sheet of paper he had been saving for years, bought for a letter he had never written. She accepted each gift with a silent nod, her eyes thanking him more than words ever could. She filled them all with her symbols, creating a library of stories he could not read but was beginning, in some small way, to understand. He was rebuilding the old stove. He had cleaned every piece, scrubbing away the rust and soot until the iron gleamed a dull gray. He was putting it back together, but he was doing it differently. Before he attached each piece, he would take a nail and scratch his own marks on the inside. He didn't know why. It felt important. He copied the symbols he had seen her draw, a circle for the sun, a wavy line for water, a crooked ladder that he thought might mean a mountain. His marks were crude and childish next to hers, but they were his. He was adding his own voice to the story. One evening, as he was fitting the stovepipe, She came and stood beside him. She pointed to a symbol he had just scratched into the metal, a simple cross inside a circle. He had copied it from a stone she had drawn on that morning. She touched the mark with her finger, then pointed to her own chest, to her heart. Then she pointed at him. You, me. The meaning was as clear as a bell. It was a symbol of connection, of two things joined together. He felt a jolt, a shock of understanding that went straight through him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a silent woman, but a person with a history, a language, a soul as vast and complex as the sky she named each night. He had bought her body, but he was beginning to see that her spirit was something that could never be owned. The nights were his classroom. He was learning the star names. There were 12 main ones she always returned to, a zodiac of her own people. He learned them slowly, his tongue shaping itself around the unfamiliar sounds. There was Ciala, the first friend. There was Anka, the hunter with the silver arrow. There was Pama, the mother who held the world in her arms. And there was Kor, the trickster, a faint, flickering star that was hard to keep your eye on. She would say the name, and then she would tell the story with her hands, a silent ballet of gestures that brought the constellations to life. Anka would draw his bow, Pama would rock her child, Kor would dance a mischievous jig across the sky. He began to see the stars not as random points of light, but as characters in a great, unfolding drama. The sky was no longer a cold, empty expanse. It was a book, and he was learning to read it. He started to use the names himself. One morning, as he was heading out to check his traps, he pointed to the fading morning star. Ciala, he said to her. She was standing by the door, and she nodded, a soft smile on her lips. It was a small thing, a single word, but it felt like a bridge between their two worlds. He was walking on that bridge now, step by tentative step, moving from the barren landscape of his own loneliness into the rich, storied world she carried inside her. He was still a stubborn, rootless man. He still felt the cold knot of the trade in his gut, but it was changing. It was no longer a stone of shame, but a seed of wonder, and it was growing, watered by the light of 1,000 ancient stars, in the quiet, patient presence of a woman who spoke a language of silence and pictures and light. The heat of summer settled over the flatlands, a heavy blanket that shimmered and warped the air. The earth cracked, and the scrub brush turned a brittle brown. The water in the well grew lower, and Ebb started rationing it, a knot of worry tightening in his chest. He watched the sky, not for its stories, but for the dark, bruised clouds that never came. He worked in the cool of the early morning and the late evening, resting in the shade of the cabin during the brutal midday sun. She seemed untroubled by the heat. She moved through it with the same quiet grace, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the dust. She found moisture where he saw none, digging for roots that held water, gathering the tiny sour berries that grew on the hardiest of shrubs. She offered them to him, her hand held out, and he took them, the sharp taste a welcome shock to his dry palate. The goat seemed to suffer most. Its coat grew dull, and it moved with a listlessness that worried him. She would spend hours with it in the sliver of shade behind the cabin, pouring precious cupfuls of water into a bowl for it, whispering to it in her soft, clicking language. He saw the tenderness in her hands, the deep well of compassion in her eyes, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was a feeling that made him both angry and sad, a longing for a gentleness he had never known. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was the first visitor they'd had since Jedediah. Ebb saw him from a long way off, a dark speck growing slowly larger in the shimmering heat. He felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. Strangers in this part of the country rarely brought good news. He took his rifle from its pegs on the wall and went out onto the porch. She had seen the rider, too. She was standing by the goat pen, her body tense, her hand resting on the goat's neck. The goat was still, its ears pricked, its yellow eyes fixed on the approaching figure. The rider was a lawman, a deputy from a town 2 days' ride to the south. His badge was a tarnished star on his dusty vest. He was a big man, with a sunburnt face and pale, washed-out eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at the same time. He reined in his horse a few yards from the porch and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Howdy," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Name's Deputy Miller, looking for a man named Jedediah Smith." Ebb's hand tightened on his rifle. "Ain't seen him." "That so?" Miller's eyes swept over the cabin, the goat pen, the woman standing still as a statue in the yard. "Funny. Last I heard, he was headed this way. Made a trade with you, I believe." "He sold me a stove," Ebb said, his voice flat, "and a goat." He did not mention the girl. He did not want to speak of it, to give it the reality of words. Miller's gaze lingered on her. "He trade you anything else?" Ebb didn't answer. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Jedediah's wanted, for theft, and for other things. Things concerning a girl he took from the reservation up north." He looked directly at her now. "A girl who don't speak English. A girl who matches her description." She did not flinch under his gaze. She stood her ground, her chin high, her dark eyes meeting his without fear. But Ebb could see the faint tremor in her hand as she stroked the goat's neck. He felt a surge of protective anger so fierce it almost choked him. "She's with me," he said, the words coming out low and hard. "The trade was square." Miller laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "There's no such thing as a square trade for a human being, friend. Not in the eyes of the law. She's considered stolen property. I'm here to return her to her people." The words hit Ebb like a physical blow. Return her. The thought of the cabin without her, of the nights without her star names, of the silence returning to its old, hollow form, was unbearable. He had bought her, yes. The shame of it was a constant fire in his gut. But she was not property. She was Ciala. She was the names of the stars and the symbols on the stones and the quiet strength that had filled the empty spaces of his life. "She stays here," he said, his voice shaking with a rage he didn't know he possessed. Miller's hand drifted down to the pistol on his hip. "Don't be a fool, Carr. I'm the law. You can't win this." Ebb raised his rifle, the stock settling into the familiar groove of his shoulder. "Maybe not," he said, "but you ain't taking her." The world seemed to stop. The heat, the buzz of the insects, the distant cry of a hawk. It all faded away, leaving only the three of them locked in a deadly tableau. Miller's face was hard, his eyes cold as chips of ice. Ebb's heart was hammering against his ribs, but his hand was steady on the trigger. He would die here, on this patch of sun-baked dirt, before he let this man take her. And then she moved. She stepped forward, away from the safety of the goat pen, and walked into the space between them. She put her hand on the barrel of his rifle and gently, firmly, pushed it down. He was so stunned, he let her. She looked at him, her eyes pleading, and shook her head. No. Then she turned to face the deputy. She stood before him, small and unarmed, yet possessing a dignity that made the big man on his horse seem small. She looked at him, and then she did something that froze the breath in Ebb's lungs. She pointed to the sky. It was the middle of the day. The sun was a white-hot fire, the sky a bleached, empty blue. There were no stars, but she pointed anyway, her finger tracing a shape in the air, a shape he recognized. It was the hunter, Anka. Then she spoke. One word. Anka. Her voice was clear and strong, a note of defiance in the oppressive heat. Miller stared at her, his face a mask of confusion. "What in God's name?" She ignored him. She pointed to another part of the empty sky and spoke another name. Pama. And another. Kor. She was naming the invisible stars, the ones that were hidden by the glare of the sun, but were still there, still burning in the vastness of space. She was showing him her world, a world he could not see, a world he could not touch, a world he could not own. She was telling him, in the only language she had, that she was not a piece of property to be returned. She was a keeper of names, a teller of stories, a citizen of the sky. Her home was not a reservation or a cabin. It was the universe. Miller watched her, his mouth slightly agape. The hardness in his face began to soften, replaced by a look of bewilderment, of awe. He had come to reclaim a piece of stolen property, and he had found this. A priestess performing a sacred ritual under the blazing sun. She finished her recitation. She had named all 12 of the great ones. She lowered her hand and looked at the deputy, her eyes calm and steady. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the silence of fear or anger. It was the silence of a man who has come face to face with a mystery he cannot solve. Miller shook his head, as if waking from a dream. He looked at Ebb, at the rifle still in his hands. He looked at the woman, standing proud and still in the dust. He looked at the vast, empty landscape around them. "I see," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't see. Not really. But he saw enough. He saw that this was not a simple matter of a stolen girl. He saw a power here that he did not understand and did not want to challenge. He gathered his reins. "I was never here," he said, his voice low. "I got lost in the heat. Never found this place." He turned his horse, and without another word, rode away, his figure slowly shrinking back into the shimmering haze from which it had come. Ebb stood there, the rifle heavy in his hands, his body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. He watched until the deputy was gone, a ghost swallowed by the sun. He turned to look at her. She was still standing in the same spot, her face turned up to the sky, as if she could see the stars he could not. He walked over to her, his legs unsteady. He stopped in front of her, so close he could see the pulse beating in her throat. He didn't know what to say. "Thank you was not enough. I'm sorry was not enough." The words he had were too small for the thing that had just happened between them. So he said nothing. Instead, he reached out, and with a hand that trembled slightly, he pointed to the empty sky. "Ciala," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not just gratitude, but a deep, shared understanding. She had saved him, not with a weapon, but with a story. She had fought for her freedom not with violence, but with poetry. He had tried to protect her body. She had protected both their souls. He lowered his hand, and for the first time, he took hers. Her fingers were warm and strong, her palm calloused from work. It was not a gesture of ownership or of passion. It was a gesture of alliance, of two people standing together against a world that did not understand them. He held her hand, and she held his, and together they stood under the invisible stars, two small figures in a vast and silent land, bound not by a trade slip, but by the shared language of the sky. The deputy's visit changed things. The threat had passed, but its shadow lingered, a reminder of how easily their quiet world could be shattered. Ebb felt a new urgency, a gnawing fear that he had not felt before, the fear of losing her. It was a selfish fear, he knew. He had no right to her. But the thought of her being taken away, of the cabin falling silent again, of the stars losing their names, was a prospect he could not bear. He started watching the horizon, his rifle never far from his hand. Every dust devil, every distant rider, sent a jolt of alarm through him. He was a man living on a wire, balanced between the quiet peace he had found and the violent world that lay just beyond the mesas. She seemed to feel it too. There was a new watchfulness in her eyes, a tension in the way she held her body. She spent more time with the goat, as if drawing comfort from its simple, uncomplicated presence. And she spent more time with her carvings. She worked with a feverish intensity, her hands rarely still. She filled every surface he gave her with her symbols, a torrent of stories pouring out of her. He realized she was not just telling stories. She was creating a record. She was writing down her world, preserving it in stone and wood and bone, so that if she were taken, something of her would remain. The sight of it filled him with a profound and aching sadness. He had given her a prison, and she was turning it into a library. The rebuilt stove now sat in the center of the cabin, a monument to their shared language. He had finished it, each piece cleaned and fitted, his own crude symbols scratched alongside the ancient ones he had found. It was more than a stove now. It was a testament, a story of two people told in iron and fire. The first time he lit a fire in it, she stood beside him, her hand on his arm. The flames caught, and the light flickered through the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls, the shadows of the symbols they had carved. The cabin was filled with a silent, moving poetry, a story that was alive. The drought broke in the late summer, with a sudden, violent thunderstorm that shook the cabin to its foundations. The rain came down in sheets, turning the dust to mud and filling the air with the rich, clean smell of wet earth. Ebb and Ciala stood on the porch and watched it, the cool spray on their faces a benediction. The water barrel filled, the well was replenished, and the land drank deep, a long, thirsty swallow. The next morning, the world was transformed. The desert was washed clean, the colors brighter, the air sharp and clear. 1,000 tiny green shoots were already pushing their way up through the damp soil. It was a time of renewal, of hope, but the shadow of the outside world remained. One evening, as she was naming the stars, 2 riders appeared. They were not lawmen. They were hard men, with guns on their hips and a coldness in their eyes that Ebb recognized. He knew their kind. Men who took what they wanted, who saw people as things to be used and discarded. One of them was Jedediah Smith. The sight of him turned the blood in Ebb's veins to ice. Jedediah's yellow grin was wider, uglier than he remembered. He had a fresh scar on his cheek, a raw red line that pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Evening, Carr," he sneered. "Heard you had a visitor, a man with a badge." Ebb stepped in front of her, his body a shield. His rifle was inside, on the pegs, a fool's mistake. "What do you want, Jedediah?" "Just came to check on my property," he said, his eyes sliding past Ebb to fix on her. "Seems you ain't been taking good care of it. Got it all skinny and scared looking." The other man chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "And I heard you got a new stove. The one I sold you was top quality, but I'm a man who's willing to trade back. Say, the girl, for your silence. We won't tell the law where to find the man who's been harboring a runaway." The threat was clear. They would brand him an accomplice, a criminal. They would take her, and he would be left with nothing but shame and a prison sentence. He looked at her. She was standing behind him, her face pale in the twilight, but her eyes were not scared. They were burning. Burning with a cold, hard fire he had never seen before. He knew in that moment that she would not go with them. She would die first, and he would die with her. But he was not a man of words. He was a man of action, and he knew, with a sudden, blinding clarity, what he had to do. It was not a choice. It was an inevitability. It was the only thing that made sense in a world that had stopped making sense. He could not fight them both. He could not win with violence. He had to use a different language. Her language. He turned his back on Jedediah. He faced her, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked into her burning eyes, and he hoped, prayed, that she would understand. He raised his hand, just as she had done so many times. He pointed not to the sky, but to himself, to his own chest, to his own heart. Then he spoke. He said the name of the star that meant home, the star that meant belonging, the star whose story was of a wanderer who finds his place in the world. He said the name she had taught him, the name that had become the anchor of his new reality. And then he made the gesture she had shown him, the one that meant you and me, joined together. He offered himself in trade, not his silver, not his silence, himself, his life for hers. He was no longer the man who pointed at her like livestock. He was the man who was pointing at himself, offering his own soul as barter. It was a desperate, insane gamble, a piece of poetry against 2 loaded guns. Jedediah stared at him, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of disbelief. "Have you gone mad, Carr?" he stammered. Ebb didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on her, his hand held steady, his heart in his throat. This was the climax of his life, the moment where everything he had been and everything he was becoming came together. He was Ebb Carr, a stubborn, rootless rancher, and he was offering himself to the stars. She looked at him, her eyes wide. She saw the gesture. She heard the name. She understood. A tear, a single perfect drop of moisture in the dry land of her face, traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She stepped forward and placed her hand over his, the one that was pointing to his own heart. She covered his hand with hers, her touch both a comfort and a seal. She turned to face Jedediah, her small body radiating a power that was terrifying in its intensity. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes, her posture, the simple act of her hand covering his, said everything. It said, "He is mine. This is my home. You have no power here." Jedediah and his companion looked from Ebb to her, their expressions shifting from aggression to confusion, and then to a kind of superstitious fear. They were men of violence and greed. They did not understand a language of sacrifice, of love, of stars. They saw two mad people, touched by the sun, speaking a language of ghosts. They saw something they could not break, something they could not own. Jedediah spat into the dust, a gesture of disgust and defeat. "Keep her, then," he snarled. "You're both crazy. You deserve each other." He wrenched his horse around and spurred it into the darkness, his companion following close behind. Their hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. Ebb stood there, his hand still held to his chest, her hand still covering his. He was trembling, his body shaking with the release of a tension so great it had almost torn him apart. He had offered himself up, and she had accepted. The trade was complete, but this time it was a trade of equals, a trade of souls. He looked down at their joined hands, and then into her eyes. The tear was gone, but its track remained, a pale line on her dusty skin. He had no words. He had never had the right words. But he didn't need them now. Their story was not written in words. It was written in firewood and goat tracks, in the symbols on a rebuilt stove, in the constellations they had named together. He slowly lowered his hand, but he did not let go of hers. He held it tight, and together they turned to face the night. The sky was a riot of stars, 1,000 points of light burning with a fierce, eternal fire. They were his stars now, too. He knew their names. He knew their stories. He was no longer a stranger in his own universe. He was home. The seasons turned. The green shoots of spring gave way to the deep, sun-baked colors of another summer, and then to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The land gave back what they put into it. The corn grew tall, and the small garden she had planted by the cabin door yielded squash and peppers and beans. Their life settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm, a dance of shared tasks and silent understanding. They were rarely more than a few feet apart. He would be mending a harness on the porch, and she would be grinding corn on a flat stone nearby. She would be washing their clothes in the creek, and he would be downstream, clearing a channel for the water. They moved around each other with an easy grace, their silences no longer empty, but full of a shared history, a shared language that needed no words. He never tried to learn her spoken language, and she never spoke his. Their communication was in the things they did, the way they looked at each other, the names of the stars they whispered together in the dark. The star names were their prayers, their poems, their declarations of love. They were the language of their souls. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a sanctuary. The walls were covered with her carvings on wood and bone and stone. It was a library of her people, a testament to a world that was vanishing everywhere but here. The stove was its heart, the symbols glowing in the firelight, telling their story over and over again. The goat grew old, its beard white, its one crooked horn seeming to droop with the weight of its years. It still followed her everywhere, its bell a familiar, comforting sound. It was the last link to the day of the trade, a living reminder of the shame and the grace of their beginning. One night, in the deep cold of winter, the goat lay down by the fire and did not get up again. She sat with it all night, her hand on its still body, her face a mask of quiet grief. Ebb sat with her, his presence a silent offering of comfort. He did not know how to mourn a goat, but he knew how to sit with someone in their sorrow. In the morning, he carried the goat's body out to the mesas, to a place where the sun would warm the rocks. He buried it deep, and on the stone that marked its grave, he carved a single symbol, the crooked horn of a friend. When he returned to the cabin, she was waiting for him. She was holding a piece of charcoal. She came to him, and with a touch as light as a moth's wing, she began to draw on his chest, over his heart. He stood still, his breath caught in his throat. She drew the symbols of her stories, the names of her stars. She drew Anka the hunter, and Pama the mother, and Kor the trickster. She was writing her world onto his skin, making him a living part of her cosmology. He had offered himself in trade, and now she was claiming him, marking him as her own, not with a brand of ownership, but with the sacred ink of her people's memory. He felt the pull of the charcoal on his skin, a strange and intimate caress. He was no longer just Ebb Carr, a man of the earth. He was becoming something more, a map of the heavens, a keeper of ancient names. The final silence between them was not an ending, but a beginning. It was a silence born not of loneliness or fear, but of a love so deep it had no need for the clumsy architecture of words. It was a silence that was full of stories, of light, of the entire vast and beautiful universe. She traced one last name across his ribs, and the stars answered.